The first type of class we have in Lumos is the component class, sometimes referred to as a custom class. These classes have underscores instead of dashes, and they show the relationship between other elements on our site. Every element on the site should have a component class applied, even if it has no styles. This future-proofs our site for any possible change we may want to make on this element as the site grows. The start of any component should end with underscore wrap, and inside of the wrap are all the elements related to that component. Component class names are made up of three parts. First, we have the type of component. This is a button component, but we could have a slider, hero, or any other type. Then we have the variation. This is a play button, but we could have an arrow button, a main button, or any other type. And the variation is optional. If there was only one type of button component on this site, we could delete the variation altogether. But in this case, since there's multiple, we'll keep that variation in. And finally, we have the element name. This is the wrap of the play button component, but we could also have the icon, text, or any other element related to this play button. This also prevents any class naming collisions. Even though we have an icon inside of the play button and another icon inside of the main button, these can have different styles because we have a different component type and component variation. And this allows us to continue building out our site in a very flexible way. So if we have a button that's maybe a slider arrow, we would have the wrap of that. And inside of that wrap, we might have a button arrow icon that could have a different style and maybe even some text depending on the design. And this creates a nice search system. So searching for button underscore shows all of the different types of buttons we have. And then we can filter it down to arrow to show only the elements related to our button arrow component. So here we have our hero condensed component. Hero is the type of component this is. Condensed is the specific variation. And we're applying wrap to our section since it's the start of the whole component. Inside that, we have our hero condensed contain for our container. In that, we have our hero condensed layout for our flex or grid. And inside that, we have our hero condensed content. Now, this hero section has a icon element. So we have our hero condensed icon. It has a text element, hero condensed text. And it also has this link that's also going to need its own text and its own icon. So the way we do this while avoiding any class naming collisions is to create a child component inside the main component. You'll notice that we've called this not hero condensed link, but hero condensed link wrap, indicating the start of a new component. So now inside of this link wrap, we can have our hero condensed link text. And that way we know this element is specific to the link component. It's not text for the entire section as a whole. And inside of that, we can also have this hero condensed link icon. So we know this icon belongs to the link component. Now, in this case, the icon is also going to have multiple pieces inside of itself, whether it be an individual SVG, maybe it would have some text or some other things. So what we don't want to do is make a child component inside of what's already a child component. We should only go one layer deep. So Lumos component classes should never have more than 3 underscores in them. And this puts us at 4. So to avoid that, we would actually want to class this child component not into the link, but into the entire section itself. So instead of nesting a child inside of a child, we'd just start a whole new one. Now, the hero condensed already has its own icon like we've seen here. So what we'd want to do instead is just rename this to something new. We could call it SVG or button. We would just choose a different component name that doesn't conflict. And now we have a button component inside of our hero condensed section, and we can start to name all of these children related to that new child. So we can call it button SVG, and we could have button text or anything else related to this child component. So we only go one layer deep with those children components, and we can have multiple different types of children component inside of our hero condensed. Like this is the icon wrap, and inside of that, we might have an icon SVG or different elements related to that. Now, another type of component other than just child components is what's called a global component. And this starts with G underscore, and this is how we know it can be used inside of any section. It's not specific to the hero section. So inside of that, we have the global link title, we have a global link icon, and we usually put these global components inside of a global slash so that we know any of these elements can be used inside of any section on our site. They're not specific to one section. The second type of class we have in Lumos is the utility class. Utilities start with U dash and they contain dashes instead of underscores. Unlike component classes, they don't show a relationship between parents and children. Instead, they're one-off classes that can be applied inside any section on any element of our site. They allow us to work faster, so if we wanted to apply our display style using only a component class, we would have to set the font size to our display font size, adjust the line height, the family, and that's a much slower process. And also, each time we create a blue label here, Webflow is adding an extra line of code to our site. So creating the component class itself doesn't add any extra CSS to our site, but by adding that blue label, that class will now show up on every page, even if the page isn't using the hero title. So we want to avoid clicking to apply styles as much as possible, and instead just add on utilities. So utilities also create their own kind of search system. If I search for U text, I'm seeing my paragraph main, large and small. I'm seeing all of my heading styles. I can use my arrow keys to navigate and hit enter to apply that class. Now, we don't want to just apply a utility directly to an element like we're seeing here. They should always be stacked on top of a component class. Because when they're applied directly to an element, it's really easy for someone inexperienced to accidentally make a change that affects the entire website. Where if that same thing happens on a component class, it doesn't affect the main U display at all. It just affects the one that was stacked on top of that component class. This also allows us to make unique changes instead of being boxed into a really templated design. If we want to set a max width, maybe only on mobile, or do a text align center or anything we need to adjust, we can make those changes freely because we're combining the utility with the component class. Now, usually with stacked utilities, if we want to change this to an H3 style instead, we first have to remove all the other classes, add the H3 utility on, and then reapply each of the other classes. And we'd have to repeat this process across every element. But if we start with a component class first, what we can do is rename this stacked utility. And it's not going to rename our main H2 class we're using everywhere throughout the site. It's just renaming the class that was stacked on top of this style guide title. So by renaming that to H3, it updates across every style guide title throughout the whole site. So if we scroll through this page, notice how every title element we're using now has H3 stacked instead. And we can repeat this process and rename the weight class if we want, or even the text color. Now notice when we try this, it says this class already exists. If you ever run into that bug with Webflow, just rename it to something that does not exist and then add the utility back on, and it will update across all elements. So on top of our text component classes, we always want to add a text utility, even if it matches the styles that were already there, because what it allows us to do is rename that utility in the future and have that update across every instance of this component, even if the component ever needs to become unlinked. And we can override anything about this utility. So here we might want to override its text transform. We could adjust its line height, even apply a max width here. And the changes that we're making here aren't affecting the text small utility itself. It's just affecting the combination of these two classes. And if we ever decide to rename this to text large, then all the overrides we applied, like this max width and like the text transform, stay in place. And it's just inheriting the rest of those text large styles. Now, as much as possible, I like to apply the overrides to the base class. That way I always know where to look for these overrides if we have multiple utilities stacked. And because our utilities were always created first and component classes are added later on, component class styles will override utility styles, no matter what order they're stacked in. The third and final type of class we have in Lumos is the combo class. Combo classes start with is dash and they contain dashes instead of underscores. Combo classes should always be created on top of another class. With component classes, we usually want to create them as the base class, and same for utilities. That way we can globally update that style across multiple different types of elements. But with a combo class, we want to make sure it's always specific to some other class. So in this case, I'm going to give it a class of isReversed, and any changes I'm making here are only affecting this isReversed on top of this icon. So one thing I might want to do here is apply a transform that actually rotates my icon to point the other way. And then if I grab this parent layout, I might add an isReversed. And even though this is the same class name, it can apply completely different styles because it's stacked on top of a different component class. So here I'm going to apply flexbox, and I'm going to make sure it's a right to left direction so that the arrow appears first. So now I'll go ahead and remove that combo, and I'll add in my gap utility, I'll add in my normal direction, and I'll also remove that combo from this icon. And what's great about combo classes is we can link multiple elements to the same component field. So on this icon, I can apply a class attribute, and I can attach is reversed, and it'll just flip the icon direction. And then on my layout for this button, I can apply a class attribute, attach is reversed, and it'll apply the opposite flex direction. So then when it comes time to link this to a component field, I can call this button reverse, and I'll go ahead and create. And then on this icon, I can go ahead and link it to the exact same component field. And that way, if we remove that class from this component field, it removes it from both the icon and the layout div. And those two elements are doing separate things. The isReverse class is different depending on the type of element it's applied to. So that's an overview of the Lumos class naming system. Be sure to check out the Lumos Docs for a full breakdown.